Okay. Okay, well, I believe it's it's about time to start. I would like to welcome everyone to the final meeting of the seminar of the Center for Institutional Studies and the HSC University in Moscow. It's our final seminar of the academic year, so the turnout is not as high as normal. Some people are already summerly minded, but we expect that some others will join us. Oh yeah, so they are. But in the meantime, we are extremely happy to greet as our speaker tonight, Professor Francesco Principe, an economics professor from the University of Padova. Francesco's PhD is from the University of Salerno. He also has 2 masters, one in economics from La Sapienza University in Rome, and another one in health economics from where is your degree from health economics, Francesca?
University of York.
Yeah, that's what I thought. Sorry about that. No, Francesca's fields are health and applied micro. He's doing some other interesting work published in highly ranked journals. And his presentation tonight is titled Too Much, Too Young, Relative Age and Adolescent Risky Behavior. Francesca, if you can please confine the presentation within 45 minutes, give or take.
Yeah, sure.
And then we'll have some Q&A. Thanks so much, Francesca.
Can you see my screen, right?
We do, yes.
Okay, so just let me move to the full screen option. Okay, here we go. All right, thank you, Leonid, for your introduction, and thanks for inviting me to give this seminar. So this is a joint paper with my colleague Luca Formarco, who is now at the University of Brno, Czechia. So this paper is about relative age and adolescent risky behaviors. So let me start with some motivations on why we want to study this. So adolescent risky behaviors like, behaviors such as smoking tobacco or marijuana, drinking alcohol, having like an aggressive behavior, of course, have an effect on school performance, and then in the future on labor market outcomes. So that's why, we really care about this stage of the let's say of the behavioral development. Of course, as it has been already pointed out by several literatures that the identification of the causes of this kind of adolescent risky behavior may lead to some improvement for what concern public health policies. Indeed, like, this kind of behavior are, broadly speaking, very costly for the society, because apart from affecting the labor market outcomes of the individuals, they also have an effect on healthcare costs. They also may lead to an increase in morbidity and to, of course, an increase in mortality. However, like, while the literature has tried to, disentangle which are the possible causes of this kind of risky behaviors in adolescents, one cause of risky behaviors that has been neglected so far by the literature, and is the one we are going to look at in this paper, is the students' class grouping policy. So basically, like, this is kind of widespread policy everywhere in the world. So basically, like, we just take people who are like born, let's say, in the same year, or like we just get to different thresholds, and then we put them all together in the same class at school. However, while this kind of policies are widespread, we do that in every country with different rules. But this kind of policy is like also somehow costly in terms of human capital formation, because most of the time we have in the same classroom people who are like very different in a sense, because they are born like 1 year apart from each other. So what do we do in this paper? First of all, we investigate which are the effects of school age class composition on risky behaviors. To deal with the possible endogeneity of this kind of relative age within the classroom, we adopt an instrumental variable strategy, and then we try to disentangle between the effect of relative age. So by relative age, I mean which is like my age in comparison to the age of the other people in the class, of the older people, from absolute age, which is the fact that I'm 14 rather than 13 today. And then we try to explore which are possible mechanisms behind this kind of relationship. Just, as a disclaimer, this is pretty much a work in progress, so feel free, to ask questions along the presentation, to give comments. We are still like an early stage of the of this project. Right, so let me give you just like an overview of the literature. So mainly here we contribute to two main strands of literature. The first strand is about the study of adolescents' risky behaviors. So of course, like previous literature has focused on different channels. One of the main channels, of course, is one of peer effect. There is this seminal paper from Nobel Prize David Card. So basically what they find here is that there are strong peer effect in this kind of risky behaviors, most of all for what concern, for example, sexual initiation, but also for the consumption of substances such as marijuana or smoking tobacco. And they also find that this kind of peer effect works like a different way between boys and girls, and in particular, this effect are larger for females. Then, of course, there are also papers studying at which are the consequences of the students' rank within the classroom on this kind of behavior. And here they also find that, of course, like the relative position in terms of rank, in terms of academic performance, has an effect on risky behaviors as well. So in general, those who do worse in class tend also to do worse in terms of, this kind of risky behavior. A more recent study from 2019 and 2021, I've tried also to understand a bit more which is the possible causal relationship behind this. So try to rely more on a natural experiment. So there's this nice paper from Reynoso and Rossi. So basically they explored this kind of natural experiment in Buenos Aires, Argentina, in which basically there was some kind of shuffling in the timetable of the school, for which like sometimes some school had to be open at night. And of course, like this kind of, timing of the school had a positive effect on the probability of having unsafe sex or consuming substances for those who had to attend school, let's say in night times. And then there is like this paper from Johansen, 2021, Journal of Health Economics. In a sense, this is probably the closest paper to ours. So she's using like this registered data from Denmark, and she finds that there is like a positive effect on relative age for what concern women's abortion and alcohol poisoning. So the main difference between this paper and our paper is that while this paper is looking at the effect of relative age across cohorts, so basically it's exploiting a kind of discontinuity between kids who are born just around the threshold, what we do here is to study the effect of relative age within classroom. So we care about not cohorts effect, but people like actually being in the same classroom. So what is the effect of being younger within a classroom on a series of behavioral outcomes? Then there is a second strand of literature to which we contribute to, and this is like the proper literature on the relative age effect. So basically, this literature is providing evidence that due to some chronological differences between classmates, the youngest pupils in the class tend to worse for what concerns school performance, but also for what concerns the development of cognitive abilities and well-being. So like being younger within the classroom seems to have like a negative effect on a series of psychological outcomes. So let me go to the data. So to analyze this kind of problem, of course, we need some data at class level. So we identify this survey, which is administrated by the WHO, which is named like Health Behavior in School-Age Children. So this is a survey which is covering adolescents in Europe and North America. And the interesting thing of this survey is that it's administrated at classroom level. So we have information about all the pupils like in the same classroom for a sample, of course, which is representative of the let's say national level where the classroom is located. Okay, we use data from 4 different waves. They range from 2001 to 2014. And our final sample consists of about 500,000 observations from students, and they cover around 33 countries. So it's kind of a big survey. So for what concern our outcome variables, we consider like risky behaviors of several types. And in particular, we consider like a broad spectrum of risky behaviors, and they try to capture, any kind of intensity of this kind of engagement in risky behavior. So we have like variables related to frequency of smoking, drinking, using marijuana, having unprotected sex. And then we also have a set of behaviors which are risky in terms of aggressiveness. So for example, we analyze the probability of engaging in fights, of being bullied or being bullied, and cyberbullied as well. So having some kind of, let's say, aggressive behaviors on the web. Okay, so now, of course, let's move to the right-hand side of our estimating equation. So relative age is the difference between the age of the student I in a class and the age of the oldest regular student in the class. So if you want to express this kind of relationship a bit more formally, basically like this is like the difference between myself and the guy who is like the older one in the class. Of course, the advantage of using this kind of measure is that this kind of measure is class specific. So this is like the main advantage compared to those studies exploiting like a regression discontinuity approach across thresholds. Of course, like for regular students, by regular student, we mean a student who has been not retained in the class. This measure can range between 0, which is when the student is the oldest one in the class, and -1, which is there is almost like 1 year difference between myself and the oldest student in the class. So when there is like an increase in this kind of variable, it means that the student I is relatively older than his peers. Of course, like there are some reasons to think that relative age, when we build relative age in this way, might be an endogenous variable. This is because due to some, let's say, students or parents unobservable characteristics, there may be some manipulation of relative age within classrooms. So in a sense, some parents might decide to delay or to anticipate the enrollment of their kids for some reason that we cannot observe here. And then, of course, we also control for the usual, let's say, social demographic variables, such as the gender of the students, or whether he's living with both parents at home. And also we have information about the family socioeconomic status. Of course, we also have like information about the amount of birth within the calendar year, because here we also need to separate the effect of relative age from the effect of the seasonal birth effect. So there is quite a huge literature showing that people who are born in the first 3 months of the year tend to do better, simply because they develop before their peers, and then they develop some skills and then can take advantage in several labor markets, but also in sports. If you think like most of the superstars in sports are born in the first section of the year, because when they compete with their peers, they tend to be older, and so they develop before their physical skills. And then, of course, in all the specification, we use wave and country fixed effects. So basically, like, we are estimating the following. We have our outcome variables, which is one of the 14 variables I was talking about before. And then on the right-hand side, we have the effect of relative age, the absolute age, a set of covariates, and of course, this kind of fixed effect by wave and country. As anticipated before, well, there are several reasons why the estimates of relative age may be endogenous, may be biased in the oldest estimation, because array is likely to be endogenous. Of course, like, there are several reasons for this. First of all, it's good, like, based on children and parents' unobservable characteristics, the parents can decide to anticipate or delay the school entry of the children, or then, you know, the children might be retained, or can skip a grade if it's particularly like brilliant, for example. And indeed, like, the same is true for the parents. If you are like a parent and your kid probably, you know, have some kind of developmental problems, you know, you may be more likely to delay the entrance of school. So there is some kind of possibility of manipulation. Of course, like, while this manipulation may be also very different across countries, so part of this manipulation is captured by our country fixed effect, we cannot make sure that the variable we are estimating is an exogenous one. So we need an instrument for this. And also, like, this is true also on the children's side, because, like, probably some children who begin school early are more likely to be, you know, particularly skilled or more brilliant, so that they get anticipated access to school. And then we use like a two-stage least square to cope with this kind of endogeneity that we need to clean up. So our instrumental variable here is like the expected relative age or the assigned relative age, which is basically like the distance from the cutoff across country. So basically, as I was telling you, we exploit the fact that there are different countries in our sample, and the cutoff date, so the date in which you get access to school, are very different across countries. So in some countries, you get access to a grade where, you know, if you're like born in January, in other countries, if you're born in September, and so on. So what we do here is to exploit this kind of heterogeneity in the cutoff dates across country as an instrument. So let me explain you like a bit better with an example here. So as you can see here in this figure, like we have like two students. One is from Luxembourg and the other one is from Scotland. So as we can see, like, both students are born in the same month, which is September here. So as you can see, like the red square is, they are born in the same month. However, like according to the cutoff date of the country, their position within the classroom is very different. Because like while the Luxembourgish students is born like exactly at the cutoff, because in Luxembourg the cutoff is September, it will be among the oldest one in the class. However, like this is not the same for the Scottish students, in which the cutoff is like in March, so it's gonna be among like, let's say, the younger one in the class. So this is the kind of heterogeneity that we use to instrument this. So basically, our instrument is given by the distance in months between the month of birth of the students and the cutoff date, which is country specific. And just like our two-stage square approach looks like this. So basically, like we have like a first stage in which we have our endogenous variable, which is either like relative age or absolute age. This is instrumented with expected relative age. And then in the second stage, we plug in the estimated value to estimate like the effect on our outcome of interest, which is like the health behaviors, the health risky behaviors that I mentioned before. Then, according to following like suggested by Young and Pitch, we also tend to separate expected relative age into dummies. This is like improve the fit of our model. Of course, like when using this kind of instrument, there are like, of course, some underlying assumption here that we need to take care of. Of course, like the first one is that relative age, birth date needs to be orthogonal with respect to demographic variable. So there is no, let's say, relationship between socio-demographic variables on the family and the targeted date of birth. This is kind of a problem in the US, I would say, but this is less of a problem in Europe nowadays. So in the US, there is like some emerging literature showing that there is some kind of targeting in the birth date for families. So like families in higher socioeconomic condition tend to target the birth date of the kids. So they want their kids to be born like in the first month of the year, because this is going to give them an advantage in the future. This is also included in like the probability of becoming, for example, like professional sportsmen, or having like just, higher wages, higher expected wages in the future compared to their counterpart. So they tend to, manipulate this, they plan the birth of the kids and they want their kids to be born in general. This is less of an issue in Europe, because like, let's say that the European welfare state is a bit stronger than the US one. So there is less tendency, to kind of manipulate these things, but still we need to take care of this. So what we do here is just to have a balanced test in which basically we show that the expected relative age is not in any kind of correlation with either like the gender of the kids, but also like let's say the condition of the parents. So if both parents live together at home, and either with different level of low, medium, and high socioeconomic state. So we can, argue that our instrument like does well in this with this respect. Then let me move now to the results. So like the first set of results is about smoking and drinking. So what do we find here? We find that like younger students within the classroom tend to do worse in terms of health behaviors. So there is like here, like we can distinguish, like, thanks to this kind of detail that we have in our data set, we can distinguish between the frequency of the action. So for example, like smoking, we have early smoking. If they ever smoke before the age of 13, then we have whether they're weekly smoking or they, sorry, this is like monthly. There is like a tab in the slide. So as we can see here, like at least for what concerns smoking and drinking, younger pupils in the class tend to be, a bit more, prone to this kind of risky behavior. So there is a higher probability for them to being like smokers or drinkers. Then when we move to the second set of results, we kind of find similar results for marijuana use. So younger pupils within the class tend to have like, an early approach to this kind of substances compared to their classmates. So there is like a higher probability for them to be smokers of marijuana. For what concerns sex, of course, like the effect that we find is the opposite. So here, while here we have like a negative effect, which means that basically like when there is an increase in relative age. So when the student is younger, there is like, sorry, when the student is older, there is a lower probability of using marijuana. For sex is exactly the opposite. So of course, like sex is a bit more of let's say topic which is related a bit more with also with the physical development of the kids. So in this case, like we have that like older students, of course, are more prone to have ever had sex, and then also to have like more risky approach to sex, and like I mean without the use of the right protections. And then we move to aggressive behaviors, so which is like the third, let's say, big set of outcomes that we want to analyze here. We see that like for what concerns aggressive behaviors, I mean, we do not find like strong evidence as in other papers showing that like basically the younger one tends to be a bit more bullied and so on. On the contrary, we see that the older ones to get a bit more engaged in fights, and we have like absolutely like no evidence about cyberbullied. So we cannot argue that younger students, I mean, that there is like just a weak evidence, only significant on 10% level that younger students tend to be bullied, but we have no evidence on cyberbullied here. Of course, like while this kind of results, you know, are somehow interesting per se, they do not give so much focus on which are like the possible mechanisms at work. Of course, like if you want to, you know, address this kind of policy, if you want to criticize that, you say, okay, probably like you're showing that people in the same class be very different just because they are younger. But okay, why is this happening? So we need to understand a bit more which are the mechanisms behind this. Of course, like identifying the mechanism in this kind of empirical design is always somehow challenging. So what we did here was just starting, let's say, from the basic and take, you know, and just to borrow from the more like sociological and your developmental literature. So we just did like a literature review on what's like psychologists think about this. Why like younger people in the class may behave in a worse way compared to their counterparts. And then we identify 5 possible channels that we want to explore here. The first one is like self-efficacy. Then there is like a sort of well-being channel. There is a self-image channel. There is an autonomy with respect to this kind of behavior channel, and then there is the peer acceptance channel. Of course, the nice thing is that in this sub we can kind of have like a nice proxies of this kind of possible mechanism, because of course here we have information, for example, about the well-being level of the students, but we also have information about self-image, because these kind of students are asked, how do you feel about your body? So whether you feel like, you know, too fat or too thin, or whether you feel like too ugly or too beautiful. So we can kind of build a measure of self-image. We know about whether kind of, you know, these kind of kids are autonomous with respect to their behaviors, because we have information whether they're allowed to go out with friends alone. And then we also talk, of course, about peer acceptances, because here, of course, one possibility is that like younger students in the class want to impress somehow their older classmates, so they tend to over exaggerate some kind of behavior. So I want to impress, I am the youngest one in the class, I want to show off to my older friends that, you know, I can do like certain things, and so I tend to be a bit more risky in my behaviors. So to understand this kind of mechanism here, we also take, like, we also borrow this from let's say more psychological literature, even though in economics these kind of methods are becoming always more popular in understanding mechanism. So what do we do here? We apply a mediation analysis. So the idea is that, of course, there is an effect of X and Y, and there are some channels. So what we do here is we try to separate the direct effect, because of course there is a direct effect, so the effect which goes from being younger in the class to behave worse, but then there is an effect which is mediated by a mediator indeed, and this is mediated, this kind of mediator is the channel that we want to address. So basically we try to separate the direct effect from the indirect one, and then this is of course like the sum of these two is the total effect that we find. So what do we do here is to apply this kind of mediation analysis to the risky behaviors that we have in our data set. And I think we can see here, while there is still like a direct effect, it's also important to notice that about 30% of the effect is mediated through performance. So basically like younger students do worse because they also perform worse at school. While the other variables, I mean, are also important in a sense. So about 12% of the effect is mediated by well-being. Being younger, there's already evidence that being younger in the class leads to lower level of well-being, and this is of course charming for worse behavior. On the other side, I mean, we don't see like strong evidence for what concern like body image and so on, and also like the lack of supervision. I mean, it's only important for 5% of this kind of results. All right, then we move to drinking, and also here we find similar results. So when we decompose our coefficient of interest between the direct effect of relative age and the indirect one for this kind of 5 mediators, we still find here that about 20% of the effect is mediated by the performance of the student. So it's still like the lower academic performance to mediate the effect between being younger and behaving worse. And while for the other variables, I mean, the effect is also like very small, so only about like between 1.5 and 6% of the effect is mediated by the other factor. We still see that student support is not very important. By student support, we see we measure whether like the student is well supported by the teacher. So it seems that teachers do not really have like a strong role in this kind of mechanisms. We find again like similar effect for marijuana use. Here, like the performance is even more important, and is about like 25% of the mechanism, and also well-being is more important. This is like kind of an expected result in a sense, because it has already been shown by previous literature that marijuana consumption has basically like 2 main reasons. One is basically like the recreational one, but there is also some kind of self-medication approach. So most of the people using marijuana, they also do that because they substitute marijuana to some kind of, let's say, psychotic substances. So they use marijuana as self-medication approach. I feel bad, so I use marijuana because it relaxes me or it gives me some kind of comfort. And finally, we also see the effect on aggressive behavior. And also here, we see that aggressive behavior are mainly mediated through performance. What is interesting to notice here is that now for aggressive behavior, also student support seems to be an important channel. So the role of teacher, I mean, is not important per se for what concerns the behaviors that relates to health, such as like the use of substances and smoking and drinking, but it seems to be important for what concerns like the aggressive behavior. So teachers do have a role in mediating this kind of things. Yeah, it was very quick. So let me give you like some concluding remarks with the summary of the results. So basically, what we show here, we show that relatively younger students are more likely to smoke tobacco and to drink alcohol. They're also more likely to smoke marijuana. The main difference between us and the previous studies is that we do not find any evidence that relatively younger students within the classroom are more likely of having bullied or cyberbullied. However, like we show that they are less likely to be involved in fight or to have bullied someone else. So the measure like of aggressiveness does not go like in a, let's say, univocal regression, in univocal direction. So this is more like mediated for the older students being more prone to this kind of aggressive behavior. Of course, like we are still like at the early stage of this project, so we want to know more about this kind of approach. In a sense, we think that our empirical approach is, quite suitable also for understanding like additional mechanisms, but also additional outcomes. For example, like which are the effects on other health outcomes, such as mental health, but also to understand a bit more, like to exploit a bit more the, let's say, cross-country dimension of our data set. We know that, of course, some of these behaviors may be very different across countries because also the country policies are very different. So, for example, in some countries, there is a bit more of tolerance towards the use of substances, or people can buy cigarettes when they're young. So we want to understand a bit more like the heterogeneous effects across like country legislation. So what we did here, this was like really like a regression that we did a few days ago. It was just to split the countries according to the European Center of Drug Control for what concerns the legislation about marijuana. So, for example, like whether they have like a severe or not severe legislation on marijuana. So we just split the country according to this index, with countries which are like above the median and countries below the median. So what we see here is that indeed like there is not like a big difference in a sense. Of course, like in countries like where there is like a not severe punishment for these. People tend to smoke marijuana earlier if you just compare like the coefficients here, but the effect, I mean, doesn't seem to be very important. So in a sense, we can argue that this kind of policy do not international policies, so apply to the entire population and not only to the people under the age, do not really play like a strong role in shaping some differences across students. All right, so this is my presentation, and thanks for attending, and I'm happy to get questions now.
Francesca, thank you very much. That's quite interesting, and for myself as well, because I was born in August, and that explains perhaps some of irregularities in my own behavior. I was a high school student. That's kind of too late to know, but better late than never. Anyway, thanks to Francesca. Plenty of food for thought, and let's see if there are any questions or comments. Bernardo, please.
Thanks, Francesco, for the presentation. I have a couple of questions. So the first one is about the instrument. So am I correct that the instrument is defined at the country level?
No, it is defined at the class level, because like it depends on the composition of the class. I mean, like the instrument is at country level in the sense that we exploit the cutoff data, which is at country level, but then the instrument is built according to the relative age, which is observed within the class. So it's kind of an individual level instrument, because it depends by the relative age of the students with respect to the cutoff date of the country.
Okay, yeah. I mean, I got that the relative age was defined at the class, but yeah, I was wondering about the instruments, and at least, yeah, okay. But thanks for clarifying.
I mean, otherwise it would be captured by our country fixed effect, and that's why we can separate the country fixed effect from the, let's say, instrument itself. If that was your doubt.
Okay, yeah, wanted to clarify that, so thanks. And my next question is about the last part when you talk about the mediating factors, and you mentioned that performance seems to be a mediating factor on some of these behaviors. Maybe this is a very stupid question, but I'm wondering, like, how can you rule out that is not the other way around? Like, I don't know, like I start drinking and therefore my performance is worse. Like, how do you deal with that? It wasn't clear to me, but.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Indeed, like, I mean, like, we are still working on this because, like understanding this kind of mechanism is always like kind of, challenging, because, I mean, you never know whether like it came first, like the egg of the chicken, and then it's, yeah, this is a good point. Like one thing that I did not mention probably is that, yeah, we do not have like a measure of, objective performance. So we just use this from the survey, in which students are asked, like, which is their performance compared to their counterparts. Of course, this may still be an issue, because like it's still like kind of self-reported performance, so you are still affected by the some kind of reverse causality approach. But the idea is of the mediating analysis, indeed, that of separating, the effect. So it's, the way I like to look at it is more like a, decomposition kind of approach. So how much of this effect is mediated? Like, but of course, probably a good robustness would be just to use like performance as an outcome, and to see also whether there is like a direct effect on performance. So that would be like a good robustness to do.
All right, thanks. Anything further, please? Bernardo, are you?
I'm thinking, but yeah, I will leave the floor for someone else, and then I will come back with the one.
Take your time to think, and then once you're ready, I'm going to let you back in. Anyone else, please? Francesca, if I may, two quick questions. The first one, you did some mediation analysis, not meditation, mediation, right?
Yes.
So there is a...
I also need to meditate, so yes.
Yeah, right, so they're closely related. Did you try what is known as the Sobel test to establish the mediation effect? Have you heard about such test?
No, I mean, to be honest, like, I'm not like an expert on this kind of analysis.
Right.
I'm kind of getting familiar with this thanks to my...
It's a bit questionable from the econometrics point of view, but this is a common tool when you do mediation.
We'll definitely
check it out. It's just to confirm that you do have statistical mediation effect. And then my second question is substantive. you said something about the peer effect. So I'm wondering how strong is this effect depending on the prevalence of that particular type of behavior that the younger student is especially likely to get engaged in, depending on the spread of that behavior in the class. I'm not sure if you have this class level data, but you don't have class fixed effect, so that's possible. In other words, I would probably first control for the prevalence of that behavior at the class level or whatever smallest entity you have, and perhaps even will consider an interaction between this prevalence and the class level and the dummy for being the youngest student. I think you might be able to find something.
Yeah, no, this is a good point. I mean, like, first of all, like I should mention that we cannot really like estimate class fixed effect, because as I was telling you, this kind of survey, which is a nice survey, has like a very long time span. So it's administrated every 4 years. So we do not observe the same classes over time. It's kind of, you know, a repeated cross-sectional survey, because like when the class is surveyed again, like there are different students. I mean, we don't have like, let's say, panel identified for students. And so like we can just exploit the country fixed effect. Also, we don't have like additional information about the school or the location of the school within the country. That's why we cannot estimate class fixed effect, because we have basically have like, let's say, officially we just observe the class once, and we don't know whether, like, you know, in the next round we observe exactly the same class. We don't have like a panel identifier. On the other side, yeah, no, the second one is a good point. Actually, we were working on something similar in a sense to understand, of course, like whether the class is like, let's say, an high prevalence risky behaviors class or not. So basically like to estimate like how many students who are, let's say, above the student size are risky students, and whether that can have an effect. But the idea of interacting that with relative age sounds like a very good idea. I would definitely do that. Thank you for the
Okay, all right. Well, thanks. I'm glad you find it useful. Bernardo, anything further?
Yes, so about like a possible policy recommendations. So according to this, would be the, let's say, the ideal, if these results are robust, like to try to group like older students among themselves and younger students among themselves?
Yeah, I mean, like in a sense, like policy implications are kind of like, you know, tricky here, because of course, like, I mean, these kind of policies like are also implemented because there is like, of course, like let's say a financial constraint. I mean, like to put up a class as a cost in terms of teachers, so people tend to, you know, to group people together, because like it's less costly to have only one teacher for 25 students rather than having like very small classes of, you know, 5 students each. Of course, I think this is kind of in line with some evidence that we have also in the literature on education, that of course also the class size matter. So I also think like in that way, having smaller classes with, let's say, more homogeneous like student population might be beneficial in a sense. So this kind of goes in that direction, I would say.
Question.
John, please.
So, Francesco, I have a very strong concern with this literature, but especially with this paper, about ignoring the more important factors, and that it's not your fault, but the literature likes to ignore politically incorrect factors. In particular, in the US, for example, ethnicity matters far more than SES or income or amount of study or background. Furthermore, there's the selection bias. I used to think this was in the US only, but when I talked to my friends in Paris, I saw the same thing. Parents can choose where their children go to school, so you don't get a random selection. Finally, there's a third issue, which is that there's potential heterogeneity of the effects. So the effects might be emphasized in some groups or subgroups than others. And the fourth issue is the issue of personality. For example, it is well known in the literature, in psychology, if you'll read it, that girls are higher on the neurotic scale than boys. Boys are higher on the aggressiveness and disagreeableness. And all these affect both who is going to instigate and who will respond badly, say with bad grades, to the same stimulus. So again, a multi-year thing is very difficult. But let me give you the example of SES. And this is something I've complained about before. Many studies in the US drop out Asians because it often contradicts the results. So a very good result is that there's a lot of studies that say, oh, uniformly, wealth is the big thing that leads to high SAT scores. But if you look in the United States, Asians from the bottom 20% of income in California outperform the richest 20% of Black families in the best areas. That is to sort of say, you have more top scoring math scores only in California, who is a tiny minority of top Asians, than all Blacks in the United States combined. So that, these are very big issues. Moreover, today, especially in say, England and Scotland, the ethnic diversity from Middle East and North Africa is leading to very differential effects. And I know in Paris, when I first went to Paris in, say, 81, my observation was people could go anywhere and get a safe school. But today, when I talk to somebody in Paris, they said, well, it's like the US. When you're children, you send them to primary school in the local school most of the time in Paris. But when they get to middle school, you have to decide, do you move to a better arrondissement, or do you send your kid to private school? So there's huge selection effect in who the initial peers are. Finally, if you look at, say, my own work on testosterone, testosterone often predicts underlying psychological traits like risk-taking and aggressiveness, which of course affects the fact that everything from grades to smoking to other things are endogenous to underlying factors. Even when you get, say, some seeming kind of time effect with these randomized studies, the problem you may have is that what's happening is the randomized studies are targeting the people who are most susceptible to these influences, right? So imagine a very good example is people whose parents were alcoholic. Alcoholism is known to be genetically transmitted. So if you keep an alcoholic child away from alcohol, he can keep away from alcohol much easier. But if you have a small positive stimulus, he starts to drink. In contrast, somebody without the alcoholic gene may hit a big stimulus and still not be influenced. So that all these confounding factors are ignored in the literature. I was looking at the list of papers you cited at the beginning, and almost all of them either ignore these factors or treat them purely as caused by the intervention, rather than themselves causing the intervention.
Yeah, no, thank you, John. This is like an amazing comment, because like gives like a lot of food for thought. Like I will just try to reply very briefly. Then for the rest, I need to think a bit more about these. Also, of course, like okay, there are some mechanisms, some channels that we cannot really like take into account. I mean, we can try to proxy them with the kind of control variables we have, but of course we cannot really deal with the possible let's say genetic concern. I mean, like of course, like we try to control for some parents characteristic. We do not have like a lot of these in the data. So basically, like we control for the fact that both parents live at home together. So this is kind of a proxy, I think, for let's say family, stability. But then for what concern, like the main concern, I think like your concern is also the main concern of this kind of literature. No, there is like an endogenous selection of students within classroom, because parents know that they want to send their students to good classes, so they try to manipulate that. I mean, one manipulation might come from, let's say, the season of birth. They target like some season of birth, because I mean, like in 2022, kids do not come from the, there is like a family planning approach, and then of course there is also like, but this is like indeed the kind of endogeneity that we want to tackle with our instrument, like exploiting the fact that okay, there might be some targeting in terms of season of birth, but it's different that is going to be related to the cutoff, which varies a lot across country. At least, like, I mean, I know that there is very strong evidence from the US about this. Indeed, we exclude like US and Canada from our main sample, because we know that this is like a huge concern in the US literature. While in Europe, I mean, at least so far, there is not strong empirical evidence on this. They may come in the future. I do not exclude that. I mean, I'm myself working on another paper, which is like kind of replication studies with the use of seasonal birth as an instrument, whether it works or not. But yeah, I understand this is a big concern. Then for what concern ethnicity, like unfortunately, we do not observe that in our data. So the only control that we have is about the socioeconomic status. We do not observe ethnicity, unfortunately. Again, probably this is less of an issue in Europe. It might be in some countries. So we kind of hope that is kind of captured by the country fixed effect, like the country composition in terms of electricity. But then again, we cannot really deal directly with that. I mean, the honest answer is this one.
Okay.
But thank you for your comments. I mean, like also I knew about your paper on testosterone, so I will probably like you to read it better to understand whether I can find some good proxies. But I don't think that's possible with this kind of data, to be honest. Thank you.
Okay, well, thanks very much for, thanks to John for a very thought-provoking set of comments. Apparently you take this matter close to academic heart. So that's very much appreciated. Let's see if there are any further comments or questions. I don't see any, so that means we're about to conclude. First of all, I would like to thank Francesco once again for presenting his work at our final session. Thanks to
Thanks for having me.
friend John Nye for participating so usefully in this last seminar. Thanks to Bernardo for being in charge for the seminar for a long time. And I wish everyone a good summer break and hope to see each other again in September. And this time there is no conventional question to Bernardo, what's up next? Because the answer is well known to everyone, and that is a summer break. Thank you, guys. Be safe and have an enjoyable summer.
Have a good summer, everybody.
Hopefully
Enjoy your
we'll
summer.
see each other again
Enjoy your
soon.
summer break.
Bye-bye. Take
Bye.
care.